On December 25, 1989, a former dictator and his wife were stood against a wall in a military compound in Romania and shot by a firing squad. Their execution filmed and broadcast to a nation that had, just days earlier, still lived under one of the most totalitarian regimes in all of Europe. The man who died that Christmas Day had ruled Romania for a quarter of a century. He had bankrupted his country, starved his people to pay off foreign debt, and built one of the most oppressive surveillance states the modern world has ever seen. Picture the sheer strangeness of that Christmas Day, because it captures something essential about how this entire story ends. Across the rest of Europe, families were gathered around tables, exchanging gifts, celebrating a holiday. In Romania, a revolution was reaching its bloody climax, and the man who had ruled the country with absolute power for 24 years was, within the space of a single hastily assembled military trial lasting barely an hour, condemned and executed, his body left in the courtyard of a military barracks. The images that emerged, of a defiant, bewildered old man and his equally defiant wife facing their final moments, were broadcast around the world. A genuinely shocking spectacle, even to a world that had watched, over the preceding weeks, the peaceful collapse of one communist regime after another across the rest of the Eastern Bloc. Romania's revolution was different. Romania's revolution was violent, and Romania's revolution ended with blood. And in the middle of all of it, running quietly beneath the surveillance, the secret police, the food rationing, and the crumbling economy, there was a car factory. A car factory that this same dictator had personally championed, that he had built by striking a deal with a Western capitalist company at the very height of the Cold War, and that produced a small, boxy, unglamorous vehicle that became, for millions of ordinary Romanians, the single most important consumer product in their entire lives. That factory did not die when the dictator died. That is what makes this story genuinely different from nearly everything else we have covered across this entire series. This factory survived the revolution. It survived the execution. It survived the chaotic, brutal collapse of Romanian communism. And then, more than a decade later, it did something almost no other company in this entire series managed to do. It not only survived its transition to capitalism, it went on to become a genuine global success, a household name across Europe and beyond, selling millions of cars in dozens of countries, and becoming one of the single most successful stories of post-communist industrial transformation anywhere on the entire continent. This is the story of Dacia, the Romanian car company that was born from a dictator's ambition, that outlived the dictator himself, and that turned out to be one of the very few Iron Curtain industrial giants to emerge from the wreckage of communism not merely intact, but genuinely, spectacularly triumphant. And it is, in a sense, the mirror image of nearly every other story we have told across this entire series. 12 times now, we have documented the fall of an industrial giant, death by freedom, death by a collapsing empire, death by internal warfare, death by fragmentation, death by legal ruling. This time, for once, we are telling a story of survival, and not merely survival, but genuine triumph. It is worth understanding then exactly why this one company, out of all of them, managed to do what almost none of the others could. To understand how a car factory in one of the poorest, most isolated, most brutally governed countries in the entire Eastern Bloc could end up as one of the great success stories of modern European industry, we need to go back to the 1960s, to a Romania that was, at that moment, trying something genuinely unusual within the Soviet sphere, carving out a measure of independence from Moscow itself. Romania in the 1960s occupied a genuinely distinctive position within the Eastern Bloc, one that shaped everything about the car industry it was about to create. Unlike East Germany or Czechoslovakia, which remained tightly integrated into the Soviet-dominated Comecon economic system and firmly obedient to Moscow's political leadership, Romania, under its communist leadership, had begun pursuing a more independent foreign policy, distancing itself somewhat from direct Soviet control and cultivating its own separate relationships with the wider world, including, remarkably, with the capitalist West. To understand just how unusual this was, it helps to remember the broader logic of the Eastern Bloc as we have documented it across this entire series. Time and again, we have seen how the Comecon system bound the satellite economies tightly together and tightly to Moscow, assigning each country its industrial specialization, Hungary its buses, East Germany its electronics and optics, and coordinating production and trade across the entire socialist world according to plans drawn up at the center. This system created exactly the kind of dependency that, as we have seen, proved catastrophic when the center eventually collapsed. Romania, by pursuing a more independent line, was to some degree stepping outside this tightly bound system, retaining more freedom to chart its own economic course, and crucially, more freedom to look toward the West when it needed technology and expertise the socialist world could not readily provide. This independence had deep roots. Romania's communist leadership, first under an earlier leader and then under the man who would define the country for a quarter century, had long chafed against Soviet domination, resentful of Moscow's tendency to treat Romania as a source of raw materials and agricultural products rather than allowing it to develop its own advanced industry. Romania wanted to industrialize, and it wanted to do so on its own terms, developing genuine domestic manufacturing capacity rather than remaining a subordinate agricultural supplier within the Soviet economic empire. This ambition, this determination to build a genuine Romanian industrial base independent of Moscow's designs, is the essential backdrop to the entire Dacia story. This relative independence had genuine practical consequences for Romania's economic development. Where other Eastern Bloc states were largely locked into acquiring their industrial technology from within the Soviet system or from other socialist countries, Romania felt free to look further afield, including directly toward Western manufacturers when it came time to build up its own domestic industries. And when Romania decided in the 1960s that it wanted a genuine domestic automobile industry of its own, capable of putting ordinary Romanian families into cars, it made a decision that would have been genuinely difficult for a more Moscow-obedient satellite state to make. It went shopping in the West. In 1966, Romania signed a licensing agreement with the French automobile manufacturer Renault, an agreement that would allow Romania to produce a Renault-designed car under a Romanian brand name, using French engineering, French designs, and French technical expertise, adapted for Romanian production and Romanian conditions. This was a genuinely significant arrangement, a communist state, deep behind the Iron Curtain, striking a formal industrial partnership with a major Western European capitalist manufacturer at the very height of the Cold War. Consider how genuinely remarkable this was in its Cold War context. This was a period of profound ideological hostility between East and West, of nuclear standoff, of proxy wars and espionage and mutual suspicion. And yet here was a French company, from a founding member of NATO, entering into a formal, long-term industrial partnership with a communist state firmly within the Soviet sphere to build cars. For Renault, the appeal was genuine. Access to a new market, a new manufacturing base with low labor costs, and the prestige of a major international deal. For Romania, the appeal was equally genuine. Access to proven Western automotive technology without the enormous cost and time of developing everything domestically. Exactly the same fundamental logic we saw driving the Soviet Union's own acquisition of German automotive tooling after the war, which we documented in our episode on the Moskvich. Romania was, in effect, importing a ready-made car industry from the West, and the fact that it could do so at all was a direct consequence of its distinctive, semi-independent position within the Eastern Bloc. The brand name chosen for this new venture was Dacia, a name drawn directly from ancient history, referring to the ancient kingdom of Dacia, the civilization that had inhabited the territory of modern Romania in antiquity before its conquest by the Roman Empire. This choice of name was itself genuinely revealing, part of a broader nationalist current within Romanian communism that sought to root the regime's legitimacy not purely in Marxist ideology, but in an appeal to deep Romanian national identity and ancient heritage. The car was to be Romanian to its very core, at least in name and identity, even as its actual engineering came directly from France. There is a genuine significance to this naming choice that connects to a pattern we have observed elsewhere in this series. Just as East Germany named its most prestigious car the Wartburg, after a medieval castle laden with deep German cultural significance, Romania reached back into ancient history for a name that would root its national car in a proud, pre-communist, distinctly Romanian identity. The Dacians were the ancient people whom Romanian nationalism claimed as ancestors, a symbol of Romanian antiquity, endurance, and independence. To name the national car after them was to make a genuine ideological statement. This car, and by extension this nation's industry, belonged not merely to the socialist present, but to a deep and proud Romanian past that long predated communism itself. It was a small but telling example of how Romanian communism, particularly under the leader about to take center stage in this story, increasingly wrapped itself in the language of nationalism and ancient heritage, rather than pure Marxist internationalism. The factory at Mioveni grew, over the years of production, into a genuinely large industrial complex, one of the most significant manufacturing operations in all of Romania. Around it grew the kind of company town we have documented across so many episodes of this series, a community whose entire economic and social life revolved around the factory, whose families depended on it for their livelihoods, and whose identity became inseparable from the cars it produced. The Dacia plant was not merely a factory. It was, for the town of Mioveni and the surrounding region, the very center of existence, in exactly the pattern we have seen in Zwickau, in Eisenach, in so many other single-industry towns across the former Eastern Bloc. This deep local dependence would, as elsewhere, make the factory's fate a matter of genuine existential importance to an entire community, raising the stakes of its eventual struggle and, ultimately, its triumph. Over the years, the Dacia range expanded beyond the original family saloon to include a variety of practical body styles, estate versions, vans, and, notably, a genuinely popular pickup truck variant, all built on the same fundamental Renault 12-derived platform. These utilitarian variants suited Romania's practical needs enormously, serving farmers, tradesmen, and businesses across the country, and they deepened the Dacia's role as the genuine workhorse of the Romanian economy, not merely a family car, but a genuine tool of daily economic life across an entire nation. The versatility and practicality of the basic Dacia design, its ability to be adapted into so many useful forms, was itself a genuine strength, and it reinforced the car's central place in Romanian life across every sector of society. The factory to build these cars was constructed in the town of Mioveni, in the Argeș region of Romania, and production of the first Dacia models began in the late 1960s. The early Dacia cars were based directly on contemporary Renault designs, most notably a model derived from the Renault 12, a solid, practical, unremarkable French family car of the era, exactly the kind of sensible, affordable vehicle that a developing socialist economy needed to begin motorizing its population. The choice of the Renault 12 as the basis for the definitive Dacia was, in retrospect, an inspired one, though its full significance would only become clear decades later. The Renault 12 was not a glamorous or advanced car. It was a straightforward, robust, easy-to-maintain family vehicle, designed to be reliable and affordable rather than sophisticated or fast. These were precisely the qualities that would make it ideally suited to Romanian conditions, to Romanian roads, and to the practical needs of Romanian families. And they were also, though no one could have known it in the 1960s, precisely the qualities that would eventually, decades later, form the foundation of Dacia's extraordinary global success under a modernized, reborn form. The car's fundamental character, simple, dependable, affordable, no frills, was baked in from the very beginning, and it would prove to be the most valuable inheritance the brand ever received. And here is where the story of Dacia begins to genuinely diverge from nearly everything else we have covered in this series, because of who was now running Romania and what he wanted this car to be. In 1965, just before the Renault deal was finalized, a man named Nicolae Ceausescu had become the leader of communist Romania. And Ceausescu was, even by the standards of Eastern Bloc dictators, a genuinely singular figure. A man whose combination of grandiose national ambition, ruthless authoritarian control, and eventual catastrophic economic mismanagement would come to define Romania for the following quarter century, and would shape the fate of the Dacia factory in ways no one could have predicted when the first cars rolled off the line. Ceausescu is worth understanding in some genuine detail, because unlike the largely faceless central planners and party bureaucrats who shaped the fate of most companies in this series, he was a singular individual whose personal decisions, personal obsessions, and personal megalomania directly determined the environment in which the Dacia factory operated for its entire communist-era existence. He had risen through the ranks of the Romanian Communist Party from genuinely humble origins, a shoemaker's apprentice who had joined the underground communist movement as a young man and spent time in prison before the war. He was, by most accounts, not a brilliant man, nor a charismatic one in any conventional sense, but he possessed an iron determination, a ruthless political instinct, and, above all, a colossal, ever-growing ego that would, over the decades of his rule, swell into one of the most extreme personality cults anywhere in the communist world. In his early years in power, through the late 1960s and into the 1970s, Ceausescu was actually regarded, both domestically and internationally, in a genuinely favorable light. He continued and deepened Romania's independent line from Moscow, famously condemning the Soviet-led invasion of Czechoslovakia in 1968, a stance that won him considerable admiration in the West, where he came to be seen as a potentially useful maverick within the communist bloc, a leader the West could perhaps do business with. Western leaders courted him. Western credit flowed into Romania, and Western companies like Renault found themselves genuinely welcome to do business in a way that would have been far more difficult in a more rigidly Moscow-aligned state. This early period of Ceausescu's rule genuinely was, by the standards of communist Romania, something close to a golden age. His condemnation of the 1968 invasion of Czechoslovakia, the very event we touched on in our episodes on Tatra and Skoda, made him a genuine hero in the West, a communist leader willing to publicly defy Moscow. He was received with honors in Western capitals. He was courted by Western banks eager to lend, and by Western governments eager to cultivate a crack in the unity of the Soviet bloc. Romania, under this early Ceausescu, appeared to be a genuinely promising place, a communist country charting its own path, opening to the West, industrializing rapidly, and building, among other things, a genuine automobile industry in partnership with a major French manufacturer. Few observers at the time could have imagined the catastrophe that lay ahead, or how completely this apparently promising leader would, over the following 2 decades, drive his country into genuine ruin. For the Dacia factory, these early Ceausescu years were genuinely good ones. The partnership with Renault gave Romanian engineers access to genuine Western automotive design and manufacturing expertise. The cars produced were, by the standards of the Eastern Bloc, genuinely solid and practical. And the relatively open, Western-facing economic policy of early Ceausescu-era Romania meant the factory operated in a considerably less isolated environment than many of its Eastern Bloc counterparts. Romanian engineers could interact, at least to some degree, with their French counterparts. Western components and Western techniques could flow, at least partially, into the Romanian operation. The factory at Mioveni was, in these early years, a genuine point of connection between Romania and the wider automotive world, a bridge between the socialist East and the capitalist West, built on the foundation of that original 1966 Renault deal. The Dacia 1300, the Romanian-built version of the Renault 12, became the defining car of an entire era of Romanian life. It was, for millions of Romanian families, the first car they would ever own, a genuine marker of a certain level of prosperity and status within Romanian society, exactly the kind of aspirational consumer good that, as we have seen across this entire series, took on enormous social significance within economies where such goods were scarce and hard to obtain. To own a Dacia was to have arrived at a certain station in Romanian life. It was practical, it was reasonably reliable, and it was, crucially, Romanian, a genuine source of national pride in a country that placed enormous ideological weight on national identity. It is difficult to overstate just how central the Dacia became to Romanian daily life across these decades. In a country where private car ownership remained a genuine luxury, where the waiting list to purchase a new vehicle could stretch for years, and where the broader economy offered relatively few consumer goods of real quality or desirability, the Dacia occupied a place in the Romanian imagination out of all proportion to its actual mechanical sophistication. It was the family car, the road trip car, the car in which a generation of Romanians learned to drive, courted their future spouses, took their children on holidays to the Black Sea coast or the Carpathian Mountains. It appeared in Romanian films, in Romanian advertising, in the everyday texture of Romanian life. It was, in the most genuine sense, the national car, and the affection and pride that ordinary Romanians felt toward it would prove remarkably durable, surviving even the catastrophic final decade of Ceausescu's rule that was now approaching. But as the 1970s wore on into the 1980s, the world around the Dacia factory began to change, catastrophically, and the cause of that change was the very man who had championed the factory in the first place. Ceausescu's Romania, through the 1970s, had borrowed heavily from Western banks and Western governments, financing an ambitious program of industrialization and grandiose national projects with foreign credit. By the early 1980s, this accumulated foreign debt had become a genuine crisis, and Ceausescu made a decision that would define the final, darkest decade of his rule and would inflict genuinely staggering suffering on the Romanian people. He resolved to pay off Romania's entire foreign debt in full, as rapidly as possible, whatever the human cost. To understand this decision, we have to understand what had happened to Ceausescu himself over the preceding years, because his transformation was as much personal and psychological as it was economic. The relatively pragmatic, Western-courting leader of the late 1960s had, by the late 1970s and early 1980s, curdled into something far darker. A genuine megalomaniac, surrounded by an extraordinary cult of personality, increasingly detached from reality, increasingly obsessed with his own grandeur and Romania's supposed glory under his leadership. He had visited certain other authoritarian states and returned apparently inspired by their extreme methods of ideological control. He had elevated his own wife to a position of enormous, unearned power within the state. And he had come to view Romania's foreign debt not merely as an economic problem, but as a genuine affront to his personal pride and to Romania's national dignity, a form of subservience to foreign capitalist bankers that he was determined to end, no matter what it cost the Romanian people. And the human cost was almost unimaginable. To generate the hard currency needed to pay down the debt, Ceausescu ordered the export of enormous quantities of Romanian food, fuel, and industrial output, diverting these goods away from the domestic Romanian population and selling them abroad for foreign currency. The result, within Romania itself, was a decade of genuine, grinding deprivation that ranks among the harshest experienced anywhere in peacetime Europe in the modern era. Food was severely rationed. Basic staples became scarce. Electricity and heating were cut back drastically to conserve fuel for export, leaving Romanians to endure genuinely brutal winters in cold, dark apartments. The population of one of Europe's most agriculturally productive nations found itself, through the 1980s, enduring genuine hunger so that their dictator could pay off Western bankers. The specific details of this deprivation are genuinely harrowing, and they matter for understanding the environment in which the Dacia factory continued, against all odds, to operate. Romanians queued for hours for basic foodstuffs that were frequently unavailable entirely. Bread, cooking oil, meat, sugar, all were rationed, and the rations themselves were often not actually available even when officially permitted. Apartments went unheated through freezing winters, with hot water available, if at all, only for a few hours a week. Streetlights went dark to save electricity. Hospitals lacked basic supplies. Television broadcasting was reduced to just a few hours a day, much of it dedicated to propaganda glorifying the leader. This was not the relatively mild, gray deprivation of, say, East Germany, where citizens grumbled about waiting lists and shortages, but generally did not go genuinely hungry. This was severe, systematic, state-imposed impoverishment of an entire nation, deliberately inflicted by a leader who had come to prioritize the elimination of foreign debt above the basic well-being of his own people. By the late 1980s, Ceausescu had in fact succeeded in his goal. Romania's foreign debt was essentially paid off, but the human price had been catastrophic, and the resentment it generated would, in December 1989, help bring the entire regime crashing down in blood. This is the context in which the Dacia factory continued to operate through the 1980s, and it shaped the car in profound ways. The relatively open, Western-facing environment of the early Ceausescu years gave way to a period of severe isolation, deprivation, and shortage. The factory continued producing its aging Dacia models, still based fundamentally on the Renault 12 design from the 1960s, now increasingly outdated as the decades passed and Western manufacturers moved far beyond it. But within Romania's shortage economy, even an outdated Dacia remained an enormously valuable and sought-after possession, precisely because there were so few alternatives, and because the broader deprivation made any functioning car a genuine treasure. The relationship with Renault itself changed dramatically over this period. In the early years, the partnership had been genuine and active, with real technical cooperation and real exchange between the French and Romanian operations. But as Ceausescu's Romania turned inward, isolated itself, and prioritized debt repayment over foreign engagement, this relationship withered. The formal licensing arrangement had, in any case, been structured to eventually give Romania independent control over production, and by the 1980s, Dacia was largely operating on its own, producing its own increasingly divergent versions of the aging Renault 12 design, cut off from the ongoing stream of Western technical development that had characterized its early years. The bridge to the West that the factory had once represented was, by the 1980s, very nearly closed, and Dacia had become a genuinely isolated operation, building an increasingly obsolete car within an increasingly desperate national economy. The stagnation of the Dacia design through this period followed exactly the same fundamental pattern we have now traced through every single company across this entire series. The Dacia 1300 and its variants remained substantially based on that original late 1960s Renault design for far, far too long, while the actual Renault models it had been based on evolved and modernized dramatically in the West. By the 1980s, the Dacia was, in engineering terms, a genuine relic, a car frozen in the 1960s, still being produced largely unchanged into a decade when Western automotive technology had advanced almost beyond recognition. But unlike the Trabant or the Wartburg, which faced a similar stagnation, the Dacia's isolation was compounded by the specific, extreme deprivation of Ceausescu's debt repayment regime, which starved the factory, like the rest of the Romanian economy, of the investment and resources that might have allowed genuine modernization. There is a genuine irony worth pausing on here. The same fundamental flaw we have documented across this entire series, the inability of a centrally planned, competition-free economy to sustain continuous improvement, afflicted the Dacia just as it afflicted every other company we have covered. But in Romania's case, this ordinary structural stagnation was dramatically worsened by Ceausescu's specific, personal obsession with debt repayment, which deliberately starved the entire economy, the Dacia factory included, of resources in a way that went far beyond the ordinary inefficiencies of central planning. Romania did not merely fail to invest in modernizing the Dacia because the planned economy lacked competitive pressure to do so. It actively could not invest because its leader had chosen to export the nation's wealth to foreign bankers rather than spend it at home. The Dacia's obsolescence was, in this sense, doubly determined, both by the general flaw of the socialist system and by the specific catastrophe of Ceausescu's rule. And yet, through all of this, the factory kept running, and the Dacia remained absolutely central to Romanian life. In an economy of shortage and rationing, the humble, outdated Dacia became something far more significant than a mere car. It became a symbol of whatever modest prosperity remained possible in Ceausescu's Romania, a genuine object of aspiration, care, and pride. Romanians maintained their Dacias with the same devoted, resourceful dedication we have documented among Trabant owners in East Germany, keeping these aging cars running for years and decades through ingenuity, improvisation, and sheer necessity, because the shortage economy made replacement so difficult, and because the car itself remained so genuinely valued. A genuine culture of Dacia maintenance and repair flourished across Romania during these years, born of necessity. With spare parts scarce and new cars almost impossible to obtain, Romanian Dacia owners became genuinely expert amateur mechanics, learning to repair, improvise, and fabricate their way around the shortages, keeping their aging vehicles alive through sheer resourcefulness. This intimate, hands-on relationship between Romanians and their Dacias deepened the car's place in the national culture, transforming it from a mere possession into something closer to a family member, a machine that ordinary people knew intimately, nursed through breakdowns, and depended upon through years of genuine hardship. This deep cultural attachment would prove genuinely important because it meant that when the regime finally fell and the factory faced its uncertain future, the Dacia carried with it an enormous reservoir of national affection and loyalty, a genuine cultural asset that few other Eastern Bloc products could match. Then came 1989, and the wave of revolutions that swept across the entire Eastern Bloc, the wave that, as we documented in our episode on the Gdansk shipyard, had begun years earlier in Poland, and that, by the final weeks of 1989, was toppling communist regime after communist regime across Central and Eastern Europe. And in Romania, this wave arrived in a form far more violent than almost anywhere else. By December 1989, the dominoes had been falling across the Eastern Bloc for months. Poland had installed a non-communist government, Hungary had opened its borders, the Berlin Wall had fallen, Czechoslovakia's Velvet Revolution had peacefully swept away its communist regime. One by one, the communist governments of Central and Eastern Europe were collapsing, mostly peacefully, mostly through negotiation and mass protest rather than open violence. But Romania was different. Romania was the most rigidly controlled, most brutally policed, most personally dominated of all the Eastern Bloc states, held in the iron grip of a leader who had shown no willingness whatsoever to reform, negotiate, or step aside. When Romania's turn finally came, in the last weeks of 1989, it would not come peacefully. Unlike the largely peaceful transitions in Poland, Hungary, and Czechoslovakia, the fall of Romanian communism was genuinely violent. In December 1989, mass protests against the regime, met with lethal force by Ceausescu's security forces, escalated rapidly into a full-scale revolution. The military ultimately turned against the regime. Ceausescu and his wife attempted to flee, were captured, and on December 25, 1989, were subjected to a hasty military trial and immediately executed by firing squad, their deaths broadcast to the nation and the world. The revolution began in the city of Timișoara in western Romania, where protests over the persecution of a dissident local pastor escalated into mass anti-government demonstrations. Ceausescu's security forces opened fire on the crowds, killing an unknown number of protesters, and the news of this massacre spread rapidly across the country. Within days, the unrest had reached the capital Bucharest, where Ceausescu, in a genuinely fateful moment, broadcast live on television, attempted to address an assembled crowd only to be met, for the first time in his entire rule, with open jeering and hostility. The look of genuine shock and confusion on his face as the crowd turned against him became one of the defining images of the entire collapse of European communism. The moment a dictator realized in real time that his absolute power had suddenly evaporated. Within days, he and his wife had fled by helicopter, been captured, tried, and shot. The speed of the collapse, from apparently total control to execution in a matter of days, was genuinely breathtaking, and it reflected just how much hatred had accumulated beneath the surface of Ceausescu's Romania across the terrible years of deprivation. The Romania that emerged from this violent revolution was among the poorest, most damaged, and most institutionally shattered of all the former Eastern Bloc states. The years of Ceausescu's debt repayment deprivation had left the country genuinely impoverished, its infrastructure decayed, its population traumatized, its economy in ruins. And into this genuinely dire post-revolutionary landscape, the Dacia factory now had to somehow find a path forward. It is worth pausing to appreciate just how unfavorable Dacia's starting position was compared to the other survivors we have documented in this series. When Škoda faced its transition, it did so within a Czechoslovakia that, while certainly facing genuine challenges, was among the more prosperous, more industrially developed, and more institutionally stable of the former Eastern Bloc states. When the East German factories faced their transition, they did so with the enormous financial resources of a wealthy, unified Germany behind them. Dacia had no such advantages. It faced its transition within one of the poorest countries in all of Europe, a nation genuinely traumatized and impoverished by a decade of deliberate deprivation, lacking capital, lacking stable institutions, lacking almost every advantage that made transition easier elsewhere. That Dacia would ultimately succeed from this genuinely dire starting point makes its eventual triumph all the more remarkable. The 1990s in Romania were, for the Dacia factory as for the entire country, a genuinely difficult and uncertain period. The factory continued producing its aging models, now facing the same fundamental exposure to Western competition that every other company in this series confronted after the fall of communism. Romanian consumers, like consumers across the former Eastern Bloc, increasingly gained access to Western vehicles, and the outdated Dacia, still fundamentally based on a design now more than 2 decades old, struggled to compete. The factory limped through the 1990s in a state of genuine uncertainty, its future far from secure, its aging products increasingly uncompetitive, its home market one of the poorest in all of Europe. Romania's overall economic transition in the 1990s was, by most measures, one of the more troubled and chaotic among the former Eastern Bloc states, where countries like the Czech Republic, Hungary, and Poland moved relatively decisively toward market reforms and attracted significant Western investment. Romania's transition was slower, more halting, more marked by political instability, corruption, and half measures. The genuine trauma and impoverishment left by the Ceausescu years cast a long shadow, and the country struggled to build the stable institutions, the functioning markets, and the investor confidence that made transition smoother elsewhere. For Dacia, this meant that the broader environment in which it was attempting to survive was itself genuinely unstable and unfavorable, offering none of the supportive conditions that helped some other companies in this series navigate their own transitions. The factory did attempt to modernize during this period, developing updated versions of its aging models and eventually introducing some genuinely new designs. But these efforts, undertaken with limited resources within a struggling national economy, could not fundamentally overcome the basic problem. Dacia was a small, isolated, undercapitalized manufacturer, building fundamentally outdated cars in one of Europe's poorest countries, facing the full force of Western competition. Without a genuine injection of capital, technology, and strategic direction from outside, it is difficult to imagine how Dacia could have survived as anything more than a marginal, declining producer, following the same downward trajectory we have documented for so many other companies in this series. And here, at this moment of genuine peril, is where Dacia's story diverges decisively and permanently from nearly every other company we have covered in this series. Because Dacia did not collapse, it did not fragment, it did not fade into irrelevance. Instead, it found a partner, and that partner happened to be the very same company that had helped create it in the first place. In 1999, the French manufacturer Renault, the same company whose designs had underpinned the Dacia from its very beginnings back in the 1960s, acquired Dacia, taking control of the Romanian company and beginning a genuinely transformative program of investment and modernization. This acquisition echoes, in genuinely striking ways, the Škoda story we covered earlier in this series, another Eastern Bloc car manufacturer acquired by a major Western automotive group, Volkswagen in Škoda's case, and transformed through Western capital and Western engineering into a genuine commercial success. But Dacia's version of this story unfolded in a country far poorer, far more damaged, and far more institutionally fragile than the Czech Republic, which makes its eventual success all the more remarkable. The symmetry of this acquisition is genuinely striking and worth dwelling on. Renault had helped create Dacia in 1966, providing the original designs, the original technology, the original foundation of the entire enterprise. For over 3 decades, through the golden early years, through the terrible deprivation of the Ceausescu era, through the chaos of the revolution and the struggles of the 1990s, Dacia had carried that French inheritance. And now, in 1999, Renault returned, not as a mere licensing partner, but as an outright owner, to reclaim and transform the company it had originally helped bring into existence. It was as though the entire arc of Dacia's history had bent back upon itself, the Western partnership that created the company returning 3 decades later to save it. There is a genuine narrative elegance to this that few other stories in this series can match. Renault's strategy for Dacia was genuinely visionary, and it turned out to be one of the most successful strategic bets in the entire modern European automotive industry. Rather than simply turning Dacia into another mid-market brand, Renault recognized a genuine gap in the global automotive market: the demand for a genuinely modern, genuinely reliable, but radically affordable, no-frills car. A vehicle that offered real quality and real dependability at a price point far below that of most contemporary Western vehicles. Romania's low labor costs, combined with Renault's engineering expertise and global distribution network, made Dacia the perfect vehicle, quite literally, for exactly this strategy. This strategic insight deserves genuine appreciation because it represented a real understanding of a real gap in the market that other manufacturers had largely overlooked. Through the 1990s and 2000s, the broader automotive industry had trended relentlessly toward greater complexity, greater sophistication, and greater expense, packing cars with ever more features, ever more technology, and ever higher price tags. This left a genuine, underserved segment of buyers who did not want or need all of this complexity, who simply wanted a reliable, practical, affordable new car that would get them where they needed to go without breaking down and without breaking the bank. Renault recognized that Dacia, with its heritage of simple, robust, no-frills engineering, its low-cost Romanian manufacturing base, and its genuine reservoir of brand recognition and affection, was perfectly positioned to serve exactly this overlooked segment. The very qualities that had defined the Dacia since the 1960s, simplicity, dependability, affordability, the qualities that had seemed like limitations in an era that prized sophistication, turned out to be exactly what a significant segment of the global market genuinely wanted. The result, launched in the mid-2000s, was a new generation of Dacia vehicles, most notably a compact, affordable family car that was genuinely modern, genuinely reliable, and priced dramatically lower than comparable vehicles from established Western brands. This car, and the broader Dacia range that followed it, became a genuine sensation across Europe and beyond. Buyers who wanted a straightforward, dependable, no-nonsense new car at a genuinely affordable price flocked to the brand. Dacia sales soared, first across Eastern Europe, then across Western Europe itself, and eventually across a range of markets around the world. In some cases, sold under the Renault badge in regions where the Dacia name was less established. The genius of this new Dacia was that it was not, in any sense, a cheap or shoddy car. It was a genuinely modern vehicle, built on proven Renault engineering, meeting all contemporary safety and quality standards, reliable and practical and pleasant to own. It was simply deliberately stripped of the expensive complexity and premium features that drove up the cost of comparable vehicles, offering exactly what most drivers actually needed and nothing they did not. This was a fundamentally different value proposition from the Cold War-era Dacia, which had been cheap because it was outdated and produced within a shortage economy. The new Dacia was affordable by genuine design, a deliberately engineered, no-frills product for the modern market. And this distinction was the entire foundation of its success. The transformation was genuinely staggering. A car brand born in one of the poorest, most isolated, most brutally governed states in the entire Eastern Bloc. A brand that had spent decades producing an outdated relic of a car within a shortage economy governed by a debt-obsessed dictator, had become, within roughly a decade of Renault's acquisition, one of the fastest-growing and most commercially successful automotive brands in all of Europe. The Mioveni factory, once a symbol of Ceausescu-era Romania, became one of the most important automotive manufacturing sites in the entire Renault global empire, employing tens of thousands of workers and producing hundreds of thousands of cars a year for export around the world. Consider the genuine scale of this reversal. In the 1980s, the Mioveni factory had been producing an obsolete car in tiny quantities by international standards for a starving domestic market, cut off from the world, a symbol of Romanian isolation and deprivation. Within roughly 2 decades, that same factory, on that same site, had become a genuine jewel of the global automotive industry, a highly productive, modern manufacturing operation exporting large volumes of competitive, sought-after vehicles to customers across dozens of countries. The physical continuity, the same town, the same factory grounds, the same fundamental enterprise, only underscores the magnitude of the transformation. This was not a new company built from nothing. It was the same Dacia, reborn, its Cold War heritage transformed from a liability into, quite genuinely, an asset. The success extended well beyond a single model. The Dacia brand expanded into a full range of vehicles, compact cars, family cars, and most significantly, affordable compact SUVs and crossovers that arrived just as global demand for exactly these kinds of vehicles was exploding. Dacia's affordable SUV, in particular, became a genuine phenomenon, offering the increasingly popular high-riding practical SUV body style at a price point far below that of established competitors, and it sold in enormous numbers across Europe. By the 2000s and into the 2020s, Dacia had become a genuine fixture of European roads, its distinctive, unpretentious, value-focused vehicles a common sight everywhere from Romania to France to the United Kingdom, a genuine mainstream success that would have been utterly unimaginable to anyone who had known the isolated, deprived Dacia of the Ceausescu years. For Romania itself, Dacia's success became one of the genuine bright spots of the entire post-communist transition. Where so many other formerly communist industries had collapsed, fragmented, or faded, Dacia not only survived, but thrived, becoming one of Romania's most important companies, one of its largest employers, one of its most significant exporters, and a genuine source of national pride, a Romanian brand, born from Romanian ambition, that had gone on to genuine global success. The significance of this for Romania can hardly be overstated. In a country that had endured genuine trauma under communism, that had struggled through a difficult and often demoralizing transition, that had watched much of its old industrial base collapse, Dacia stood as living proof that Romania could produce something genuinely world-class, that Romanian workers and Romanian factories could compete and win on the global stage. The Dacia brand became, in a very real sense, a source of restored national confidence, a symbol that the humiliations and deprivations of the Ceausescu years were genuinely behind the country, and that Romania could take its place among the successful, modern economies of Europe. Few post-communist success stories carried this kind of deep symbolic weight, and fewer still delivered it in the form of a genuine, self-sustaining, globally competitive commercial enterprise employing tens of thousands of people. There is, too, a genuine continuity of character that connects the Cold War Dacia to its triumphant modern successor, and this continuity is worth appreciating. The Dacia of the Ceausescu era was defined by simplicity, robustness, affordability, and practicality, qualities born partly of necessity and partly of the original Renault 12 design's own no-frills character. The Dacia of the modern era is defined by exactly the same qualities, now deliberately chosen and skillfully engineered rather than imposed by shortage and isolation. In a genuine sense, the modern Dacia succeeded not by abandoning its heritage, but by embracing it, by taking the very qualities that had defined the humble Cold War car, simplicity, dependability, affordability, and transforming them from the marks of a deprived socialist economy into the deliberate, winning proposition of a modern global brand. The soul of the Dacia, its fundamental, unpretentious, practical character, survived the entire journey from communist shortage economy to capitalist global success, genuinely intact. So here is where this particular story lands, and here is what makes it meaningfully, fundamentally different from nearly every other story we have told across this entire series. Almost every company we have covered was, in one way or another, a casualty of the collapse of communism, killed, diminished, fragmented, or absorbed. Even Skoda, the great success story we covered earlier, survived essentially by surrendering its independence entirely to a Western owner. Dacia's story shares that basic shape, a Western acquisition transforming an Eastern Bloc manufacturer, but it carries a genuinely distinct and, in some ways, more hopeful lesson. Because Dacia demonstrates that even a company born in the very worst circumstances the Eastern Bloc had to offer, in a country as poor, as isolated, and as brutally misgoverned as Ceausescu's Romania, could, given the right partner, the right strategy, and the right moment, not merely survive the transition to capitalism, but genuinely flourish within it, turning its very poverty, its low costs, its no-frills heritage, into the foundation of a genuine global success. This is genuinely worth dwelling on, because it complicates the otherwise relentlessly grim pattern this series has documented. Across 12 previous episodes, the overwhelming lesson has been one of loss, of collapse, of the brutal and often unjust destruction of enterprises and communities that had, whatever the flaws of the system that created them, represented genuine human achievement and genuine human livelihoods. And that lesson is real and important. But Dacia offers a genuine counterpoint, a reminder that the story of the Eastern Bloc's industrial transformation was not uniformly one of destruction. Some enterprises, given the right conditions, genuinely did make the leap, genuinely did find a place in the new capitalist order, genuinely did turn out better on the other side than they had ever been before. Dacia is the fullest, most complete example of this hopeful possibility that this entire series has to offer. And there is a genuine question worth asking here. Why Dacia and not the others? Why did this company, from such an unpromising starting point, succeed so spectacularly when so many others from far more favorable positions failed? The answer, insofar as there is one, seems to lie in a genuine combination of factors that came together in exactly the right way. There was the original Renault relationship, which provided both a natural acquirer and a foundation of proven engineering. There was the fundamental character of the product, simple, robust, affordable, which turned out to be perfectly suited to a genuine and underserved segment of the modern market. There was Renault's specific strategic vision, its willingness to invest genuine capital and to bet on the radical idea of a deliberately affordable, no-frills, modern car. There was Romania's low-cost manufacturing base, which made the entire economic proposition viable. And there was, underlying all of it, the deep reservoir of brand recognition and genuine affection that the Dacia had accumulated across decades of Romanian life. Remove any one of these factors, and it is easy to imagine Dacia following the same path to oblivion as so many others in this series. Together, they produced one of the genuine miracles of post-communist industrial transformation. There is a genuine irony worth sitting with here, one that connects the beginning and the end of this entire story. Dacia was born from a deal with Renault in 1966, a communist state reaching out to a Western capitalist company to build its national car. And Dacia was ultimately saved and transformed into a global success by a deal with that very same company, Renault, more than 3 decades later. The Western partnership that created Dacia was, in the end, the Western partnership that saved it. The dictator who championed the factory, who bankrupted his country and starved his people, who was executed against a wall on Christmas Day 1989, is long gone, his regime a dark memory. But the factory he built, from that original French deal, lives on, transformed almost beyond recognition, one of the very few genuinely triumphant survivors of the entire Iron Curtain industrial world. There is a final irony, too, worth naming, one that speaks to the deep strangeness of how history actually unfolds. Nicolae Ceausescu built the Dacia factory as an expression of Romanian national independence, of Romania's determination to industrialize on its own terms, free from Soviet domination, a genuinely nationalist project wrapped in the ancient name of the Dacian kingdom. He could not possibly have imagined that his national car project would ultimately achieve its greatest glory, not as a symbol of socialist Romanian self-sufficiency, but as a wholly owned subsidiary of a French capitalist corporation, selling millions of cars across the very Western world his regime had ultimately turned against. The Dacia succeeded, in the end, by becoming almost the precise opposite of what its founder had envisioned. A triumph of capitalist integration rather than socialist independence, of Western partnership rather than national self-reliance. And yet, in becoming that, it delivered to Romania a genuine, lasting prosperity and a genuine, lasting source of national pride that Ceausescu's own catastrophic policies had so comprehensively denied his people. History, as it so often does, delivered its gifts through means entirely opposite to those its actors intended. So what, in the end, is the lesson of Dacia, set against the 12 stories of loss and collapse that preceded in this series? Perhaps it is simply this, that the fundamental flaw of the communist economic system, its inability to sustain competitive improvement, was real and was, in the end, fatal to that system. But the enterprises that system created, the factories, the workforces, the accumulated skill and knowledge, and even the brands themselves, were not necessarily worthless, not necessarily doomed. Given the right conditions, the right capital, the right strategy, the right integration into the genuine competitive markets the old system had lacked, some of these enterprises could be genuinely transformed, genuinely saved, genuinely made to flourish. The tragedy of the Eastern Bloc's industrial collapse was never that its factories and workers were incapable. It was that the system had failed them, and that the transition destroyed so many of them before they could find their footing in the new order. Dacia is the great exception, the enterprise that found its footing, that made the leap, that proved what might have been possible, under better circumstances, for so many of the others. 13 industrial and commercial giants now, all built somewhere within or behind the same broad iron curtain, and 13 genuinely different endings, and this one, uniquely among nearly all of them, is a story not of collapse, but of a genuine, hard-won, and thoroughly unlikely triumph. A car born from a dictator's ambition that outlived the dictator, outlived the regime, and went on to conquer the very capitalist world its creators had once stood against. Let us know in the comments which Iron Curtain industrial giant you want us to dig into next, and subscribe, because there are plenty more of these stories still waiting to be told.